The beginning of the 16th century in Europe, which had only just recovered from the plague, was marked by another nightmare, the epidemic of syphilis. And this sickness, like the plague, spared no one, neither promiscuous men nor faithful husbands, nor girls of easy virtue, nor the good-looking and also faithful wives. Where did this terrible plague come from? Scientists are still debating. The only thing that is known with confidence is where the name itself came from. Today's topic is syphilis in Europe and spread of this illness. You're watching Flip Side of History. Welcome. The illness was originally called different names in Europe: Neapolitan disease, French sniffles, Hussar disease, Gall disease, and so on and so forth. In literature, however, the disease has survived as syphilis. And so dubbed terrible curse physician Girolamo Fracastoro, who in his work, which was published in 1530, the name of the disease in the title said syphilis, or ungolish disease. The word itself owes its origin to the mythical swineherd Syphilis, who, according to the legend, so enraged the gods that he was punished with a terrible and incurable disease. There are three main versions of where the syphilis epidemic came from in European countries. The first is the African one, the essence of which is that already in ancient Rome signs of syphilis were recorded in the African colonies, and the inhabitants of Pompeii were even found to have traces of congenital syphilis when their bone remains were analyzed. The second version is that somehow the disease appeared in France and from there spread all over Europe during the campaigns of Charles VIII. However, the proponents of this theory answer with a shrug of their shoulders as to exactly where syphilis originated in France. Lastly, the third and, in the opinion of many, the most realistic version is that the virus was introduced to the European continent by the Spanish voyagers led by Christopher Columbus, who caught the virus in the West Indies. It was there, as well as on the islands of the Caribbean archipelago, that the syphilis epidemic first broke out, and only then did the local beauties give the disease to the Spanish sailors, who brought the disease to Europe. The spread of the syphilis epidemic across the continent is evidence of this particular version. When the troops of Charles VIII conquered Naples in 1494, the victors organized a very real sexual bacchanalia in the fallen city. For example, a 16-year-old Neapolitan girl was known to have been raped by several French soldiers. When the poor girl's father came to complain to the French king himself, the king just sympathized and nothing more. The fact is that Charles VIII himself in Naples led a far from puritanical life. The French historian Breton, who witnessed what was happening in Naples, wrote that it was not uncommon for the guards to find couples entwined on the lawns, around the uncleared tables, in the early morning where sleep had overpowered them. It must be said that such madness was not limited to the king's entourage. Almost the entire army was at the mercy of a veritable love fever. And many witnesses assured us that often French soldiers simply grabbed the girls and women they liked without any respect for the individual. The result, consequently, was quite devastating. How many of the women were carriers of syphilis brought by the Spaniards is unknown. However, mass intercourse led to the fact that the virus spread in the French army with incredible speed. The same Breton wrote, "The poor paid a high price for a moment of pleasure. Their bodies were crusted from head to knees. Some had their mouths caved in, others went blind. The latter, however, can be considered lucky, for they could not see their rotting bodies." Within a single month of the fall of Naples, Charles VIII's army was gripped by an unprecedented epidemic that spared no one, neither chaste priests nor promiscuous soldiers and officers. So, suffering terrible losses from an unknown disease, the French hastily abandoned Naples and began to retreat into France. Correspondingly, they brought home not only the misery of defeat, but also a virus unknown to science. Soon syphilis spread throughout France, the states of the Holy Roman Empire, and as early as 1496, syphilis reached Poland, Hungary, and even the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, from where the epidemic spread to the territory of the Duchy of Moscow and the Zaporozhian Sich. Even the first wave of the epidemic was practically similar to the plague in its overall scale. About 5 million people died in Europe, and in the middle of the 16th century it was syphilis that was the most common cause of death in the Old World. The so-called second wave of the epidemic affected the Asian and African regions more, where about 5 million people died of the disease in China and about 10 million across Asia and Africa. Since that time, syphilis has been an almost invariable companion of multiple generations. Even studies of the remains of soldiers in Napoleon's army showed that many had all the signs of congenital syphilis. It has been quoted as saying, if an army of 30,000 men went on a warpath, at least 10,000 of them were infected with syphilis. The impacts of this disease for world history, especially European history, were disastrous. First of all, the loose morals of sexual life immediately fell under the ban. The representatives of the Holy Church, it must be said, not unreasonably declared that the main cause of the spread of syphilis was sexual promiscuity. For this reason, chastity quickly became popular, and many women and girls, in order to preserve their chastity, went to monasteries. And there were so many who wished to live the rest of their lives outside the walls of the monastery that the women prioresses even arranged a thorough examination, immediately rejecting those who had even the slightest sign of this illness. The second major change was Europe's abandonment of bathhouses. This is because Europeans used to bath in public baths, but the spread of syphilis instantly put a stop to such establishments. We must admit that both chastity and the ban on public baths had their effect. The syphilis epidemic also made quite serious changes in fashion. Long hair, mustaches, and beards were not a dandy anymore, but a demonstration that a man who did not have syphilis was standing in front of you, since he had all his hair in place. In turn, the fashion for wigs came about for the opposite purpose, to hide the consequences of syphilis, namely, total baldness. By virtue of this, it was those with drooping noses, the first signs that a person had acquired syphilis before, that began to be hired as maids in wealthy homes. Wealthy townspeople and nobles understood that it was much safer to have a secondary or tertiary carrier of viruses as a servant, who was less likely to become infected, than to hire a pure-faced girl who would be the first carrier of the infection. And we have to note, plastic surgery, which is completely understandable, appeared due to the epidemic of syphilis. Ultimately, perhaps the most terrible consequence out of all, costing the lives of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, was the religious wars that led to the infamous witch hunt. When chastity, which had become the norm of life, did not bring the expected decline in the epidemic, and many of the pastors still fell ill, many questioned the faithfulness of the church's postulates. Unfortunately, at that time, few people knew that syphilis was not spread only through sexual relations. For example, the evangelical branch of Christianity, Protestant Church, which preached complete abstinence, emerged in that time. By the way, the bloody massacres of Catholics and members of the Huguenots, as well as the Night of Bartholomew, were consequences of the same division. It should be pointed out that doctors immediately began to search for cures for the dangerous disease. Paracelsus, for example, suggested rubbing of quicksilver. The external result was indeed achieved, but the disease itself did not disappear, especially since the accumulation of poisonous metal in the body itself led to death. One of the most interesting things was that the doctors realized that the pathogen would die at high body temperature. This method of treatment was used, for example, by the Zaporozhye Cossacks, who, after seeing the signs of the disease, went to the swampy base to catch malaria. The attacks of malarial fever, oddly enough, ruthlessly dealt with the syphilis pathogen. Many people have recommended taking crushed glass or something similar to provoke a high body temperature. The main purpose is to cause internal inflammation. It was not until a medication was invented in 1906 that finally and ruthlessly destroyed the dangerous virus that the problem of curing the real curse, and not only of Europe's curse, was finally resolved. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Also, watch our other videos on this channel.